They didn't just own people, they engineered an entire human supply chain, written into law. In colonial Virginia, a mother's womb became legal property. By 1705, the state decreed not only that lives could be bought and sold, but that children, born through forced breeding, were counted in ledgers as future profits. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was the blueprint of the most horrifying slavery breeding farm in history, a monstrous machine built for endless labor and unimaginable gain. The economic engine that powered the American South did so by multiplying suffering, not chance. But how did such a system come to exist, and who designed its rules? The answer begins far earlier than most ever realize. In late August 1619, a battered English ship called the White Lion anchored off Point Comfort, Virginia. On board were between 20 and 30 Africans, men and women taken from the kingdom of Ndongo in present-day Angola. They were exchanged for food and supplies, then sold to the highest bidders. None of them had chosen this journey. Their arrival marked the beginning of something new in the English colonies: forced labor, not for a set term, but for as long as their bodies could endure. Tobacco was already transforming the Chesapeake. The crop's leaves promised wealth for those who could grow enough, but tobacco devoured labor. Fields needed clearing, planting, weeding, and constant tending. At first, planters relied on indentured servants from England, people who traded years of work for passage across the Atlantic. But the demand for labor kept growing. As tobacco profits soared, so did the hunger for more hands in the fields. Year after year, ships brought more Africans to Virginia and Maryland. Some were treated as indentured servants, able to earn freedom after a set time. But that window closed fast. By the 1640s, the number of Africans in bondage was rising, and their status was changing. English servants could eventually walk away. Africans, increasingly, could not. The rules were shifting, pushed by the logic of profit and the demands of a crop that never rested. Plantations multiplied along the rivers, James, York, and Potomac, spreading inland as planters carved new fields from the forest. The work was relentless. One tobacco farmer could manage only a few acres alone, but with a crew of laborers, a planter could claim dozens. Those who owned the most workers rose quickly. The pressure to keep fields full and tobacco moving to port drove planters to seek labor that would never run out, never leave, never demand wages. By mid-century, the colony's leaders faced a problem. Indentured servants were running short. England's economy was improving, and fewer poor men and women were willing to gamble their lives on the Chesapeake. Meanwhile, the memory of Bacon's Rebellion, an uprising of angry, landless former servants, still haunted the elite. Planters wanted a workforce that could be controlled absolutely, one that couldn't claim rights or demand land at the end of a contract. The answer came in law. By 1662, Virginia's Assembly passed a statute that would shape generations. The status of a child would follow that of the mother. If a woman was enslaved, so was her child. The principle was simple, brutal, and effective. It meant that children born on plantations would be enslaved for life, no matter who their father was. The supply of laborers would now grow from within, generation after generation. The system was locking into place, driven by the needs of a crop and the calculations of profit. The transformation from temporary servitude to permanent, hereditary slavery had begun. By the middle of the 17th century, Virginia's lawmakers had begun to write human inheritance into law. In 1662, the General Assembly made a single line of statute carry the weight of generations. A child's status would follow that of the mother. This doctrine, called partus sequitur ventrum, broke with English common law, which had always traced lineage and inheritance through the father. Now, if an enslaved woman gave birth, her child would be enslaved too, no matter who the father was, no matter his status or color. The law was blunt, but its effect was precise. It made the womb itself a source of property, turning every enslaved woman's body into a kind of living capital for her owner. The legal machinery didn't stop there. By 1705, Virginia assembled a sweeping code that spelled out exactly who could be owned, how, and by whom. The new law, titled An Act Concerning Servants and Slaves, divided the world into two classes: those who could own and those who could be owned. Anyone not born Christian or of black or native ancestry could be held as a slave for life. The code declared that enslaved people were not just laborers, they were chattel, personal property, to be bought, sold, inherited, or mortgaged like livestock. It became illegal for white people to marry anyone of color, and any property, horses, cattle, pigs, held by an enslaved person was automatically forfeited to the parish. No enslaved person could testify in court against a white person. If an enslaved person ran away and was caught, the law allowed for whipping, branding, even dismemberment. If an enslaved person died from punishment, the owner faced no legal penalty. The law's reach extended into the most private corners of life. Enslaved people could not gather for worship, could not leave the plantation without a written pass, could not own a weapon, could not trade or hold money. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal standing. Children born to enslaved mothers belonged to the owner and could be sold at any age, for any reason. The system did not merely tolerate family separation, it depended on it. With every birth, a new asset appeared on the ledger, and with every sale, a family line was broken to balance the books. These statutes did not just enforce labor, they engineered society. They made reproduction itself a business transaction, protected by law and enforced by violence. The law's language was cold, but its consequences were intimate and devastating. In the eyes of the state, a child was not a person first, but a commodity, a line in an inventory, a future field hand or house servant to be mortgaged or sold. The legal code had turned human life into perpetual property and made the creation of more enslaved people not just possible, but profitable. In 1793, a Connecticut inventor named Eli Whitney patented a device that would change the American South forever. The cotton gin, a simple machine of wire teeth and spinning brushes, made it possible to pull sticky seeds from short staple cotton. Something that once took a full day by hand could now be done in minutes. Before Whitney's machine, cotton was a stubborn crop, profitable only along the coast where long staple varieties grew. But with the cotton gin, planters could grow short staple cotton almost anywhere in the deep South. Suddenly, fields that had been considered worthless sprang to life with row after row of cotton plants. The numbers tell the story. In 1790, American planters produced about 3,000 bales of cotton. By 1800, the total had jumped to 73,000. 2 decades later, it reached 400,000. And by 1850, the South was shipping 2.85 million bales a year, 3/4 of the world's cotton, most of it bound for booming textile mills in England and New England. Cotton became the backbone of the American economy, accounting for nearly 60% of all U.S. exports by mid-century. But the gin didn't just make cotton profitable. It created a hunger for land and labor that seemed impossible to satisfy. Planters pushed west, clearing forests and draining swamps to plant more cotton. Each new acre meant more hands were needed for planting, tending, and picking. The price of enslaved people soared. In Virginia, where tobacco fields were wearing out, enslavers found a new source of profit, selling people to cotton planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The cotton gin turned what had been a patchwork of small farms into a vast, interconnected engine of extraction. It wasn't just a tool, it was a catalyst. With every bale that left southern ports, the demand for enslaved labor grew. By 1850, 1 out of every 3 Southerners was enslaved, and the population of enslaved people had climbed from under 700,000 in 1790 to nearly 4 million. The South's wealth, its cities, and its political power all rested on this single crop, and the people forced to cultivate it. Cotton's rise set off a chain reaction. The need to move raw cotton to market and to move people spurred new roads, steamboats, and rail lines. The trade in enslaved people became more organized and more brutal, with traders like Franklin and Armfield building networks that stretched from Maryland to New Orleans. The cotton gin didn't just change agriculture, it transformed the entire Southern economy into a machine built for profit, powered by the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children. Franklin and Armfield didn't just traffic people, they built an entire supply chain around it. From their 3-story headquarters on Duke Street in Alexandria, Virginia, they ran the largest slave trading operation in the country. Every detail was calculated. Their advertisements in the Alexandria Phoenix Gazette promised cash more than any competitor for likely young Negroes of both sexes between the ages of 8 and 25 years. Sellers from across Virginia and Maryland responded, arriving at the brick compound with children, teenagers, and young adults, all destined for the Deep South. Inside the complex, the main house served as both office and residence, but behind it stretched a high-walled pen, whitewashed and imposing, built to hold hundreds. Men and women were separated, each group locked away at night in rooms with barred windows and heavy doors. During the day, they were led into roofed courtyards, watched by armed guards. The jail was designed for volume, corridors wide enough for lines of people, kitchens that could feed crowds, and a tailor shop where enslaved women sewed clothing for the journey south. Every inch was built for efficiency, control, and profit. Franklin and Armfield moved people like freight. During shipping season, they loaded brigs like the Tribune, Uncas, and Isaac Franklin, each capable of carrying 75 to 150 people at a time. The ships left Alexandria on a schedule as regular as any railroad, the 1st and 15th of every month. On board, the holds were fitted with platforms so people could be stacked in 2 layers. The manifests, stamped and sworn before customs officials, listed names, ages, and destinations: New Orleans, Natchez, Baton Rouge. The transport was brutal but systematic. The firm's captains kept to their timetables, and the ships returned north for more human cargo as soon as they unloaded. In the summer, when river travel slowed, Franklin and Armfield turned to the roads. Coffles, long lines of chained men, women, and children, marched out of Alexandria, west along the Little River Turnpike. Each group moved about 20 miles a day, covering nearly 1,100 miles, to reach the markets of Mississippi and Louisiana. John Armfield often led these marches himself, riding at the front with a gun and a whip. Men were locked together with iron collars and chains, women tied with rope, children riding in wagons. Local residents grew used to the sight. So many coffles passed through that toll keepers complained of traffic jams at the gates. The scale was staggering. At their peak, Franklin and Armfield bought and sold between 1,000 and 2,000 people each year. Their network stretched from Baltimore and Richmond to New Orleans, with agents in every important city along the way. They ran ads promising quick sales and safekeeping for anyone intended to be shipped, charging 25 cents a day for storage in their compound. The business was relentless, precise, and cold. Every sale, every shipment, every mile walked was a line on a ledger, a calculation in a ledger book. The pipeline they built fed the insatiable hunger of the Deep South for labor, turning Virginia's surplus people into cotton profits for Louisiana and Mississippi. In the process, they turned the domestic slave trade into an industry, one that moved thousands of lives each year, all with the efficiency of a modern corporation. Rain fell steady and cold on the morning of March 2, 1859, as buyers crowded under canvas tents at the 10 Brock racecourse outside Savannah. Inside the stables, 436 men, women, and children, most from the Butler plantations on the Georgia coast, waited in silence. Some clutched hands or huddled together, trying to shield infants from the damp. Others stared straight ahead, their faces set. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the barn, reading names from a ledger. Rose, age 22, with her daughter, 9 months. Jeffrey, 30, field hand. Little Sam, 4 years old. 30 babies were listed, some not yet walking. Pierce Butler, deep in debt and desperate to satisfy his creditors, had ordered the sale. For 2 days, families were separated and inspected like livestock. Buyers from Alabama, Louisiana, and South Carolina pressed close, checking teeth, feeling muscles, asking about skills. No one spoke of husbands or wives, only of age, health, and price. The youngest fetched $250, strong men over $1,200. When the auction ended, the tally reached more than $300,000, an enormous sum, enough to erase Butler's debts and make fortunes for the traders. But the cost was counted in tears. Witnesses called it the weeping time. A reporter described mothers pleading to keep their children and siblings clinging to each other until forced apart. As wagons loaded with the newly sold rolled out through the mud, the rain kept falling. For those left behind, the world had split in two. One side bound for distant fields, the other left with memories and empty arms. The Butler sale was the largest recorded slave auction in American history, a moment when the machinery of profit and law reached its most efficient and its most merciless form. Families were not just broken, they were itemized, priced, and scattered to the wind. In August 1831, a preacher named Nat Turner walked into the Virginia night, carrying only a hatchet and a vision he believed was sent from God. For 2 days, Turner and his followers moved from farm to farm, freeing the enslaved and striking down their captors. By the time the sun rose on the second day, nearly 60 white men, women, and children were dead. Turner disappeared into the woods, sparking a manhunt that would last 2 months and a wave of terror that swept across the South. The courts tried and executed dozens. Hundreds more were killed in reprisals, their bodies left at crossroads as warnings. But Turner's rebellion did not end with the hangings. His trial records, pages thick with testimonies, survived as proof that even in the heart of the system, people risked everything to break its chains. Most resistance did not shout. It moved quietly beneath the surface. Henry Bibb, a man born into slavery in Kentucky, wrote that, "Deception is the only weapon of the weak." He described how enslaved people feigned illness, broke tools, and worked slowly, all under the watchful eyes of overseers. Bibb's own escape took years of planning, false starts, and coded messages. It is useless for a poor, helpless slave to resist a white man in a slave-holding state, he wrote, for public opinion and the law is against him, and resistance in many cases is death to the slave. Women, too, found ways to fight back. On cotton plantations, some learned to use the root of the very plant they picked, cotton root, as a secret shield. Chewed or brewed as tea, it could prevent pregnancy or end it. Mary Gaffney, who spent her life in bondage, later told interviewers, "I kept cotton roots and chewed them all the time." Mazer, he wondered what was the matter. For nearly a decade, she bore no children, denying her enslaver the profit of her body. Others whispered recipes for pennyroyal or blue cohosh, passing knowledge from mother to daughter, friend to friend. In the words of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, enslaved men and women are not passive victims. They resist with every means at their disposal, in fire and in quiet, in hope and in defiance. Not every act made headlines or found its way into court records, but every broken tool, every secret gathered root, every child taught to run, each was a refusal. Together, these acts lit small, stubborn fires that never went out, even in the darkest corners of the breeding farms. Banks in New York and Philadelphia built fortunes on the collateral of human lives. At the height of the domestic slave trade, thousands of enslaved people in Louisiana alone were mortgaged to northern lenders. Records from J.P. Morgan Chase show that two of its predecessor banks, Citizens Bank and Canal Bank of Louisiana, accepted about 13,000 enslaved people as collateral between 1831 and 1865. When borrowers defaulted, the banks seized more than 1,200 men, women, and children and sold them to recoup losses. Insurance companies profited too. Aetna issued policies that reimbursed enslavers if the people they owned died. Policies capped payouts, often at $800, rarely covering the full value of a skilled worker. But even that was enough to make human lives a routine line item in ledgers from Connecticut to Charleston. In 1846, a New York life agent sold more than 30 policies in a single day in Richmond, insuring enslaved people for Southern clients. These arrangements turned people into assets that could be bundled, borrowed against, and traded. By the eve of the Civil War, the combined value of enslaved people in the United States was estimated at over $3 billion, more than all the nation's railroads and factories combined. In the North, profits flowed quietly through dividends, interest, and insurance premiums, fueling the growth of banks and companies that still exist today. The legacy of these deals lives on, not just in ledgers and archives, but in the persistent wealth gap between Black and white Americans. The numbers are staggering. If Black households held a share of national wealth equal to their share of the population, the gap would exceed $10 trillion. The roots of that divide run through the vaults and boardrooms that once treated human beings as the safest investment of all. The numbers don't flatten out with time. Today, the typical Black household in America has about $44,900 in wealth. For white households, that figure stands at $285,000. That's a gap of $240,100, wider than it was just a few years ago, even as both groups saw their net worth rise. The Federal Reserve's latest data confirms what families have felt for generations. Wealth grows where it's already planted. If Black households held a share of the nation's wealth equal to their share of the population, the total gap would reach over $10 trillion. Some estimates, factoring in lost wages and compounding over centuries, push that figure to $20 trillion. But the divide isn't just national, it's local. In counties where slavery was most entrenched before the Civil War, children born to low-income parents today face the longest odds of moving up. In these places, a child with parents in the bottom fifth of earners has about a 4% chance of reaching the top fifth as an adult. That chance more than doubles in counties with no recorded enslaved population. The pattern holds even after accounting for differences in schools, jobs, or local economies. The scars of forced labor and lost inheritance still run through property records, credit scores, and the value of a family home. Credit Bureau data tells the same story. Black families descended from enslaved people have, on average, disposable incomes over $11,000 lower than those descended from free Black Americans. Their credit scores trail by more than 30 points. home ownership rates lag, and business ownership is harder to reach. Each gap adds up, generation after generation. The result is a map of mobility that traces the old slave counties, where the past is never just the past, and where the long shadow of stolen labor still shapes who gets to build wealth and who is left with less. In 1859, 436 men, women, and children were sold in a single auction known as the Weeping Time, raising over $300,000 for the Butler plantation owners. This event, documented in sales ledgers and eyewitness accounts, illustrates the scale and deliberate organization of slavery's economic system. Laws like Virginia's 1705 Slave Code and innovations such as the cotton gin enabled the forced reproduction and trafficking of people for profit. Financial records show that by 1860, enslaved people were valued at $2.7 billion, with banks and insurers directly invested. Yet, the full number of those born and lost to these breeding farms remains unknown, as countless records were destroyed or never kept. Today, the legacy is visible in a $20 trillion racial wealth gap documented by economic studies. The evidence makes clear this was a system designed, enforced, and profited from. Its consequences endure. Remembering these facts is not just history. It is a warning written in law, ledger, and living memory.